good afternoon, and good evening, depending on wherever you are. Welcome to today's discussion of elevating procurement's role from back office to boardroom. Hi, everyone. My name is Darshan Deshmukh, President at ProcureAbility, and I'm excited to have a special guest joining me for this discussion today. Pierre Mitchell, Chief Research Officer and Managing Director at Spend Matters, now part of the Hacker Group. Pierre, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Darshan, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. So, traditionally, procurement was seen as a support or back office function. So today we'll look at like how do we move procurement from back office to boardroom, how to transition from a cost focused function to a strategic enabler for growth. Uh, for the audience, if you have any questions, please drop in your questions as you go, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. And if we don't have time, then we'll follow up with any afterwards. So let's dive in. So let's start with setting the stage for today's conversation. Procurement's role is really hard, and especially in the current environment with market uncertainty, tariffs, supply chain disruptions, it's creating a tremendous challenges for all of us. But it's also creating a great opportunity to add value. Many CEOs and the C-suite in the business unit see procurement as a cost function and not necessarily as a growth engine for revenue. Uh, Keeping up that narrative that keeps on pushing, then it's a support function or a back office function. But there are some market leaders that look at these various industries and they are using procurement not only to save money, but also enable revenue and drive growth. So, Pierre, I have a question for you: Is if procurement has this great potential, why aren't most CEOs seeing it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think the probably the biggest thing, like you mentioned, is it's still you think it's might think it's a mature function, but it's still an emerging function, right? Especially when it had started quite often, under finance and or maybe under supply chain or multiple places or nowhere at all. And it's shocking, right? Because with an astounding 5x, 10x ROI, right? If you really do it right. I mean, you'd be like, well, why, I can't think of a better place as a function to invest my money. But, at the same time, it's been kind of buried, right? And I mean, I think it's great to be an enabler, but you got to be kind of out front and really having more visibility around the value that it drives. So, I mean, if you've got kind of the spend management aspect under the CFO, right? And focused, and the CFO very focused on OpEx and efficiency, and that's fine. But on the direct side, you kind of might be buried over there on the direct side under supply chain, which more on the supply management side, which is certainly important as well. But it kind of gets a little lost when it's kind of enabling, but not really out front around the value that it drives. And I think, the final thing that I think we'll talk about is kind of just moving beyond cost savings to what the CEO is really interested in, which is going to be around enterprise value, right? And growth and sustainable growth and digitalization and AI, right? And all those things are going to drive the corporate valuation that the CEO is mentioned on. So I think, maybe turn back to you around, some of the growth
Yeah.
discussion, topic that you want to have.
So before we go into that, Pierre, one more question I have is: You work with hundreds of CPOs in the industry as part of your role.
Yeah.
Are you seeing a trend in like there is more and more appetite around CPOs and the chief supply chain officers being part of the decision making? Are you seeing a trend upward trajectory? Like what's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I love your input on too. I mean, I do see it a lot more on the supply chain side, just given what's happening with all of the geopolitical risk and the VUCA world, tariffs, everything that touches the value chain, right? And as our supply chains get more digitized, and as we move, to everything is becoming more digital, it's getting much more front of mind. So I think with executive VPs, heads of chief supply chain officers that can also be the CPO or have the CPO working for them. I think there it's getting a little more visibility on the finance and kind of on the CFO side and trying to break out of there. I don't know. It's a little more mixed. So I'm seeing a little bit more on the strategic and kind of supply side versus the spend side. I don't know. How about yourself?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the same thing. Is especially in the industries where cost of goods sold is such a big portion of your overall P&A,
Yeah.
P&L. The
Yeah.
chief supply chain officer tend to get a lot more visibility because it drives significant value, and but then it also translates into the stock price, right? So then that becomes
Yeah.
kind of just the nature of general conversation.
Yeah.
So going into like a little bit more on the growth side of the conversation now. I mean, one of the perception that exists, especially for procurement organizations, is you only focus on cost and compliance. And when you think about organizations, growth is non-negotiable. Like it's just part of, like, if once you go into a C-suite conversation or a CEO conversation, it's always all about what's your growth plan looks like, how does it translate into a stock price, what multiple you're going to get, which is basically directly proportional to your growth. uh, Speed to revenue or revenue enablement becomes a key part of overall responsibility for procurement. And a lot of organizations and the CPOs that we work with, uh, the conversation is always around, is your organization seen as an enabler for that growth, or does business actually see it as a barrier? Like, do they see you as more of a compliance organization versus actually revenue enablement organization? Um, so when you think about that, if your role participates in the growth discussion, then you have the seat at the table. But if you are more on the cost side and the compliance side, then generally you don't have the seat at the table. That's what we're kind of seeing that as part of like overall picture within various industries. Um, but when you think about like how organizations are set up, if you're seen as a growth enabler, you tend to have a very powerful position within the organization. So I'll use an example. Our parent company, Jabil, the chief supply chain officer, chief procurement officer actually directly reports to the CEO, which we're seeing more and more of that trend. But how important that function is for companies' profitability, but then also from a growth trajectory perspective, uh, Frank gets that seat at the table directly working with the CEO, and we're seeing a lot more of those types of roles kind of spanning out depending on the industry. So it's not just kind of going into the finance organization, but also focused on like building the strategy for the organization. So the next conversation I want to kind of have is one of the key deliverable for a chief supply chain officer or a chief procurement officer is speed to revenue. And what does that mean for procurement? And how does procurement help or hinder that objective that a CEO or a C-suite will have? Any thoughts there?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the whole things around procurement and its transformation and is around influence, right? And to the
Mhm.
extent that it can be not at just the proverbial seat at the table, but in reality, there are multiple tables, and there are multiple processes where revenue is impacted. And I think this is kind of, the opportunity, right, is to be able to be like, okay, for speed to revenue from, let's say, a new product development introduction standpoint, right? I think that kind of the speed to revenue there is kind of understood,
Yeah.
certainly, and pharmaceutical or whatever, right? And but more and more through AI, digitalization, service innovation, that ability to do early supplier innovation, what percentage of your revenue has, suppliers involved to driving new types of revenue streams. How do we tie into supplier budgets for innovation, right? And tap that and become a customer choice and tap all that stuff. But, there are multiple revenue areas, right? Just working on, with marketing, and to how do we, improve investments in marketing, digital marketing to get more uplift
Mhm.
and get the most bang for the buck, because all the functions have limited, kind of budget. It could be on the M&A side, right? And you guys got acquired, right? And you got acquired for a reason, and a very smart
Mhm.
company for, making an investment here because of all the market intelligence, right? And all things that you guys do. But, that's another thing, right? Transformation, right? The transformation is a whole area where, hey, we're going to transform so that we can drive more revenue through digital channels or, whatever. Supply chain, right? And how do we tie to revenue there? Revenue at risk. How do we take the tariffs discussion and look at that not just from a profitability and cost impact, but also on the export side? What are the, well, how does this touch product, profitability and portfolio plan? All these things. These are all multiple tables. All these are all multiple places to tie to that revenue, discussion. So I mean, I'd love your input on this too, Darshan.
Yeah, and I think it was like when you think about it, like sometimes it's not obvious. So, but it's been going on for a while. So I started my career around 20 years ago in the services company, and we had a group called Customer Solutions Procurement, and that group was basically the responsibility was working with and partner with the consulting deal teams on the sell side
Hmm.
because more than half of the content was third party
Yeah.
spend. So the role was to, yes, negotiate the best deal possible, but the role was to actually win the deal working with the consulting sales organization, right? So that's like, if you think about it, that's like true revenue enablement as part of the procurement organization. And that group were all really seasoned procurement professionals that knew procurement really well, but could actually stand in front of the client to build a solution that was really workable for them, right? So that's like
Well, it's
a good
manufacturing
example.
too, right? I mean, a tier one automotive or a contract manufacturer like you guys, right? That ability to improve that win rate percentage by
Yeah.
having a highly capable procurement function that brings the market intelligence, brings all these things to bear and shows
Yep.
that to the customer, right? And the customer's like, oh yeah, we want to work with this customer because they got their
Yeah.
supply markets, under control. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think coming back to like more on the some of the organizations that we look at is like a procurement business partner role, right? Where their goal is to really working with the business units to build the category plans that support their overall P&L objectives.
Right.
And what we're seeing is revenue growth is one of the key metrics that is given to those individuals along with cost savings, right? So it's not just cost savings, but it's also enabling the business unit revenue growth. And once you add that as part of the responsibility or like incentives drive behavior,
Right.
you really change the way you think about what your role is, right? And then I
Mhm.
think that's very critical when it comes to revenue enablement.
Totally.
So when you think about like maybe expanding that a little bit further, one is the revenue and the growth aspect of it. Uh, what do you think when procurement leaders think about value? Do you think they really truly understand what the C suite or the CEOs say what value means to them? Or are we still a little bit wired to think myopically around what procurement's role is? What you're seeing in the industry right now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's like the most overused word out there, right? Is
Yeah.
value, and at the
Mhm.
same time, yeah, I mean, a lot of time procurement talks again about certainly cost savings, but a little bit on the cash side, but then it gets kind of diffuse, right? And I think one of the biggest areas, and to kind of not push back on, but to clarify with the business is how in fact is value being defined from an enterprise valuation standpoint, from
Yeah.
an EVA, whatever the metric is. How
Mhm.
does that set up, and how does that then decompose down to the business units and the functions? Because at the end of the day, those are going to be the metrics that you're going to want to jointly move
Yeah.
with the business move it, with the business
Mhm.
units and and the functions, right? So I would just think like brand value and brand multiple. Well, how do you
Yeah.
impact that? Well, that is a place where supply risk can play, right?
Yeah.
What about the recurring revenue? And we want to go to AI and digital. Well, great. How do we have a metric around that, right? And percentage of revenue that is going to be subscription based or things like that. So that's where it's kind of forcing clarity around the enterprise performance measurement and management kind of process and the scorecard itself. And just by getting alignment around that and enforcing that discussion, it just has its own value too, so that you get aligned with the stakeholder, not just on the cost side.
Okay, great. Great input. Thanks for that. So I think before we move on to now the metrics that like we should be thinking about, just from a growth and how do you get the seat at the table, just for the audience, quick pulse check. Uh, if you think about your procurement organization, are your metrics currently focused on cost or growth or both? But if maybe choose a cost or growth and just type in the chat box there. Let's just take like 10 seconds. So I think when you think about the split, you see a lot of cost, which is not surprising because a lot of procurement organizations still focused a lot on cost, and then they see that as a P&L improvement as part of their responsibility. So I want to kind of transition here into a little bit more of the metrics or the key areas that people should be thinking about when it comes to like gaining that credibility with the C-suite or the CEOs. I think I want to kind of divide them into like maybe three major buckets. Number one is we talked a little bit more about that is procurement's contribution to revenue. That's number one. Number two is speed to revenue, like how can you accelerate that? And then number three would be how do you capture the market share or increase the market share? All of these three metrics, if you think about it, is really how do you get higher multiple for your EBITDA, right? I mean, that's generally the key focus here. So one question I want to ask, like if you kind of think about these three themes, um, what is an important mindset shift like a procurement leader should have to actually drive these three metrics within the organization? Like, what do you see is the key transition that individuals need to go through to get to these types of metrics for the procurement organization?
Yeah, I think it ties back to your previous question around um, value and how you measure that. And I mean, there's that notion of kind of the balanced scorecard, right? And
Yeah.
what you have from a business standpoint needs to be translated to the supply chain, to your
Mhm.
value chain, right down to the functions, and then within procurement, engaging with those stakeholders to link, your objectives to that balanced scorecard. So if there is not a clear metric, enterprise metric, around supply risk, right, and
Yeah.
around revenue contribution, and around that's a problem because if you're going to just be doing this as a little nice to have, that's an issue. Now it's okay to kind of go bottoms up, right? I mean, so like I think one of the just practical things you can do is if you're using kind of the old two by two of like the Kreylig matrix or whatever, the impact versus complexity, it's like burned into our into our DNA. That y-axis on impact is not spend, it's
Yeah.
business impact, right?
Mhm.
And that business impact is going to be revenue and profitability, right? There's a cash piece, and obviously cost. So I think developing that business scorecard that you work at the category level and down to the supplier level and make sure that it is balanced, it's linking to those kind of revenue objectives. And if you got nothing to link to, that is a governance. You got to raise that, right? And be like, is this important or not? And if so, how do we then link to it directly with the business units or through engaging with marketing for revenue uplift and marketing programs or, whatever. So I think just taking your approach that you do for category management and supplier management and just making sure that the measurement itself is
Yeah.
actually aligned with the business and making sure that there is something to align to is honestly half the battle.
Yep. And then I think once you figure those out, like how do you change the mindset and the approach within the organization? Now, if you want to kind of turn those actions into outcomes, uh, I think just the playbook to kind of follow is a structured way, like what we see as an overall approach that the organizations take. And then when we work with our clients, first of all, figure out like the procurement activities that drive revenue, right? So, for example, if you think about supplier collaboration and tie it to innovation cycles and then measure that, that's going to drive a very different behavior from a revenue enablement perspective.
Yeah.
Second would be embed product and sales teams and procurement growth metrics together. So, like, agree on them jointly so that it's basically a joint KPI during the launch period. Now, that drives a very different behavior. And then finally, uh, can have a growth dashboard for that is boardroom ready. Don't like one of the observations that we have is when you think about a procurement dashboard, it tends to be super heavy with cost savings and compliance and hundreds of different data points, and it gets lost into the noise. And if you think about like the boardroom, they're going to most probably care about only three or four major things that ties to revenue, growth, and P&L impact. And
Hmm.
how do you drive that boardroom ready growth dashboard that the CEOs and then the EVPs and the business unit leaders can see and can actually talk through? I think that changes the dialogue. And if you can have that kind of just the playbook and from driving the conversations at the C level, I think you're going to get this seat at the table when it comes to driving that conversation. I want to kind of maybe switch gears a little bit. And if you think about, we talked a little bit more about category management, talked about supply relationship management. If you think about the value chain for procurement, um, what activities might be kind of overlooked when it comes to linking to like revenue generation? So if you think about the value chain, and people don't really think about it as those activities that are tied to revenue, and they should be focused on that.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I kind of touched on a little bit on the metric side, right around kind of the category performance and how do you
Yeah.
define that balanced scorecard, right? But I
Mhm.
mean, it is worth emphasizing when you think about category management, there's always kind of two sides to it. So there's kind of
Yep.
like the market facing classic, right? How do we understand the supply markets, the dynamics around it? Where's their leverage? But almost immediately, you're kind of not focused enough on the demand side. And quite often, your stakeholders are kind of putting you in a box around these are the things you get to attack and the levers, but don't touch these other things. I think your point before, which was spot on, like number two, was jointly, come up with those joint metrics that both, groups work on so that when you have that boardroom deck, you can be like, this isn't just a procurement thing. This is like what we're doing with the business around, let's say, enabled innovation, of
Yeah.
which we're just helping to foster and collaborate, with design teams and with our digital teams and with the suppliers and setting that up for success. So I think one of the biggest things is think about kind of not just the category management from like the market side, but kind of this customer management, kind of and the stakeholder management, and make sure you're aligning to what they're measured on, out to the business and out to the customer, like you're mentioning before, on aligning, to the sales process with the procurement process. That's the key linkage in my mind. I'd love to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
on that, Darshan.
I agree completely. I think when it comes to really looking at category planning, category management, and then tying it to the supply relationship management from kind of just the driving the tip of the spear to the change and the innovation, I think that's very critical as part of the overall value chain. So,
Yeah.
all great points that you kind of just shared. So now, when you think about, so you kind of figured out where you need to focus on, what sort of metrics you want to drive. Now it's really claiming that seat at the table, right? And pulling all of these together. The one key part is really we need to change the mindset from, for lack of right word, like cost police to a growth partner, right? When it comes to that, like the whole organization needs to drive that. So I want to kind of use our own example on Jabal side, where Frank, our chief supply chain officer, chief procurement officer, reports to the CEO directly. Um, Not only has a responsibility for procurement and supply chain, but also being the strategic business partner with the business units that are responsible for the P&Ls, right? And in those, we are procurement is seen as a strategic partner for the business. And there are key roles within Frank's organization that are strategically placed to manage strategic relationships with like top 100 suppliers that count significant portion of the spend profile and but significant portion of revenue on Jabil side. Because it's contract manufacturing, so there are a lot of strategic relationships that are kind of managed, like hundreds of them. But the top 100 plus suppliers are managed very strategically, and each individual supply chain relationship manager actually is measured on the revenue with that supplier, not necessarily cost savings delivered with that supplier. Like, can you actually grow the revenue with that supplier? Cost savings will come in as part of your overall category planning, but from a strategic standpoint, it's important that you drive that collaboration with the supplier and drive that growth, right? So you're driving a very different behavior from a growth perspective. So what I want to kind of talk about, like, and kind of get into a little bit more of a rounding this up, is as a procurement team, we should stop justifying cost savings and cost, and we should start leading with growth. I think that's the key part of making sure that we get that seat at the table with the CEOs and the C-suite. So I think before we wanted to kind of make sure there is a little bit of time. If there are any questions, let's see if there are any questions in the chat box. And if not, then you could always type those in and we can do a follow up. I think we don't have any questions in the chat box unless there are any. Okay. So I want to kind of close this session. So thank you, Pierre, for sharing your insight. I think it was a great conversation uh, for the team that joined. Hope you gain valuable insights and you can challenge your own organization to kind of think a little bit differently. And if you'd like to learn more, connect with us on LinkedIn. You can scan the QR code that is at the top of the box here. And thanks again for joining. And we hope to see you in future procurability events soon. Thank you very much. And thanks,
Thanks,
Pierre.
everyone. Thank you.